What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with a box office breakdown for Sunday, July 19th, where not only has Christopher Nolan proved once again he is the most successful filmmaker in the world at this time, but he's also increased the distance between himself and his closest rivals by a pretty healthy margin. So here are the numbers. Domestically, the Odyssey opened to $125.5 million, well ahead of projections, with an additional $139.6 million abroad, bringing the film's global total to $264.1 million. Heading into the weekend, $200 million was considered a slam dunk. So I'm sure all the executives at Universal are going to be exchanging very hearty high fives for the rest of the week, because this is the biggest live action opening of 2026 so far, even with an R rating. So you can take that conventional wisdom about PG-13 and throw it right out the window. This is also the biggest opening ever for Matt Damon, and it is the third biggest opening of Christopher Nolan's career, behind The Dark Knight Rises and The Dark Knight. Also, I should add, the film received an A grade on CinemaScore, so the movie will likely have very long legs. True IMAX theaters are sold out for the next few weeks, and in some cases, they're showing the movie around the clock. So once again, Nolan is not only the biggest director in the world, I would add he's the biggest star in filmmaking, period. Name another figure in the world of movies who could get the entire planet to talk about Greek mythology all weekend, because for the last few days, every time I log on to YouTube or X or wherever, all I see are people debating the movie or posting paintings from their favorite scenes, or talking about the original text, or debating the pros and cons of some earlier adaptations in the world of TV and film, or also just talking about sword and sandals movies, period, which is pretty rare. The sword and sandals genre in filmmaking hasn't really thrived since the 1950s. And as a fan of Greek mythology, and as a fan of sword and sandal movies, and as a fan of just historical epics, period, I think that's cool. This is what it feels like when movies are at the top of the pecking order of the culture. The apex predator, which is right where I like them to be. And best of all, he's a filmmaker who still makes movies on film. They're handing out these little frames of film at the Village East by Angelica, where I saw the movie. But apparently when he was shooting the Odyssey, the big IMAX cameras, they're so big and so cumbersome and so loud, he was only able to shoot for 3 minutes at a time. And the actors are like, wow, like those cameras are really loud, in spite of IMAX's best efforts to try to contain the noise. It's almost like going back to the early days when movies made the transition from the silent era into sound. Oftentimes then they'd have to box up the cameras in these kind of soundproof booths, which limited the movement of the cameras. But to Nolan's credit, he did get the cameras moving on the Odyssey. But the fact that Christopher Nolan insists upon making this movie on film, shooting on actual locations, with actual sets, with actual props, and people like it, people totally embrace it. I feel like Hollywood and filmmaking overall should definitely be taking notes. Stop remaking cartoons with actors standing in front of a green screen, where the movie just looks like basically a carbon copy of what came before 10 years ago. Moana, I'm looking right at you. So the big question now is, who's going to follow in the footsteps of Christopher Nolan? Who's someone like in their 20s and 30s now who's looking at his career and saying to themselves, like, that's who I want to be? Because Christopher Nolan, he looks to the past, to filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick and David Lean, and he learns by their example, like the people who actually did know how to make these kinds of movies in a bygone era. But obviously, Christopher Nolan's not going to live forever. He's had an incredible career that's lasted now, 27 years. And he said there's going to be a healthy break between this movie and the next movie, because I think this movie was incredibly physically taxing. So he says that it's going to be at least 3 years before his next film. But looking ahead, who are going to be the young filmmakers in the 20s and 30s who are going to embrace premium formats, and more importantly, embrace the topics and the subject matter that is worthy of premium formats? And also, will Dolby and IMAX and all these premium formats, will they invest the necessary money to build more true premium screens? I love Dolby, I love true IMAX, but I feel like when it comes to the rivalry between streaming and the theatrical experience, premium formats, that's the real differentiator. I feel like that's the thing that really gets people into their car, heading to the theater. But really, Christopher Nolan, apart from a few other filmmakers, maybe like Denis Villeneuve, I feel like he's one of the guys who's been leading the charge the most. And James Cameron, yeah, you need to stop making Avatar movies and try some new subject matter. Maybe we can pressure James Cameron into going back to the beginning of Greek mythology and depicting that classic war between the Titans and the gods of Mount Olympus. But there are a lot of filmmakers out there these days who very successfully follow trends, but there's a very short list of filmmakers who can buck conventional wisdom, who can buck trends, who can create new trends, or just do something that's considered box office poison, because when it comes to big budget movies in general, but not always, the R rating is considered, box office leprosy. People always will encourage you to lean into PG-13, but obviously the Odyssey went in its own direction. But more importantly, sword and sandal epics, historical epics, movies about mythology, those movies have really struggled in the 21st century, apart from a few obvious exceptions. People love movies like 300, people love movies like Gladiator. Troy people like a lot now, but it didn't necessarily do that well at the time of its release. But because this is a box office breakdown, what I want to do today, just to give us the proper perspective on Nolan's accomplishment, we're going to look back at the entire career of Nolan in terms of opening weekends and final box office tallies, and perhaps that'll help us make an accurate prediction of just how far this movie might go in terms of its final box office total. I think the only possible obstacle right now is the fact that people seem to be favoring the premium screens over regular theaters, and also in 2 weeks' time, Spider-Man's coming our way, and that might soak up all the oxygen in the room. But let's start back at the very beginning of Christopher Nolan's career with a little scene movie called Following. And I need to tell you a very, very quick story about one of my two encounters with Christopher Nolan in real life. My first encounter with him was unremarkable. A couple of my friends and I were in LA in a grocery store, and we saw him come in. We're like, oh my God, that's Christopher Nolan. And he had just made Memento, which made him a big superstar in the world of independent films. But we didn't talk to him or anything. We just said, oh, there he is. And then that was it. But in 2014, I was at the Slam Dance Film Festival with an animated movie called Sheetin, where I was one of the executive producers. And as a special treat for all the filmmakers participating in the festival, they had Christopher Nolan come in and give us a little sit-down lecture for like 50 or 60 of us, because Nolan got his start with Following at the Slam Dance Film Festival. And famously, I think 11 people showed up for that first screening of Following, and he was a little demoralized. I think he was a little low in his spirits with that poor reception of the film. But as he told us on that night, he said, and yet 9 years later, I was releasing The Dark Knight in theaters. And he says there's no real secret or like silver bullet apart from just a lot of really, really hard work. And what's undeniable is that over the last 27 years, and with 13 feature films to his name, Christopher Nolan has probably worked harder than any other filmmaker alive. But just to put things in perspective, Following, which opened in 1999, Following had an opening weekend of $1,636. Yeah, that's not super impressive, and it had a final worldwide box office total of $240,000. So how far has Christopher Nolan come in 27 years? Going from $240,000 worldwide total for his debut feature film to now opening to more than $260 million with the Odyssey. But things really started to take off for him when he made Memento. And I can still vividly recall in 2001 where the independent craze of the 1990s was kind of drawing to a close, but there were still a few standouts every once in a while, like, whoa, who's this new filmmaker? And Christopher Nolan was one of those guys where when Memento came out, it just was like throwing a hand grenade into the filmmaking scene, where it just seems so stylish and so fresh and so innovative. And you can see how his preoccupation with the manipulation of time is still very much at play in his recent crop of movies. But Memento in 2001, it had an opening weekend of $235,000 with a final box office tally of $39 million. So yeah, he was moving up in the world because that movie was inexpensive and had a production budget of roughly $5 million. So anytime you make a movie that grosses more or less 8 times its original production budget, well then people are going to take notice, which is why he started getting offered some really interesting opportunities. And this is when he went to work for Warner Brothers, an affiliation which lasted from Insomnia up through Tenet. And famously on Tenet, Warner Brothers and Christopher Nolan had a parting of the ways, and yeah, he's never going back. That Universal's got him probably until the end of his career. But when he did the remake of Insomnia, and I prefer the original of Insomnia, but in 2002, Insomnia had an opening weekend of $20 million. So suddenly he's getting big opening weekends. And it had a final box office total of $113 million. And this was a much more expensive movie. It cost $46 million to make. It had Al Pacino and Robin Williams. So he had arrived as far as Hollywood was concerned. And this is when he started chasing a lot of big directing opportunities, like Troy, which he famously got turned down for because that job went to Wolfgang Peterson. But because he didn't get to make Troy at that time, he always had this lingering desire to return to the subject matter, which obviously he just did in triumphant fashion with the Odyssey. But what he did do instead was Batman Begins in 2005. And this is when his whole life changed, because famously, Batman Begins was not that successful a movie. It's incredible how people remember that movie so fondly, but that movie had an opening weekend of $48 million, But his final box office tally was kind of unimpressive, $356 million. And keep in mind, that movie cost $150 million to make. So he was moving up big time in terms of budgets, 3 times the budget of his previous movie. But you would have thought a movie as solid as Batman Begins would have taken off like a rocket. But in hindsight, when you think about the popularity of The Dark Knight, you would think that Batman Begins was some giant global phenomenon, but it kind of underperformed. And thankfully, Warner Brothers didn't panic and they kept him on board for future installments. However, for his next movie, he would press pause on superhero movies, and he went off and did a personal film, an original film, and I think one of his best films, The Prestige from 2006. Not a box office juggernaut, but it's the kind of movie that builds up your filmography and builds you lifelong fans. So that movie had a production budget of only $40 million, so he scaled way back from the budget of Batman Begins. It had an opening weekend of $14 million and a final worldwide box office total of $104 million. So it still remained to be seen at this point whether or not Christopher Nolan would ever reach his full commercial potential, which he proved on his next movie, a genuine cultural phenomenon, The Dark Knight from 2008. And when this movie came out, I mean, I don't know how many times I saw it in the theater, but I kept going back and I would drag people with me. I'm like, you've got to see this movie in the theater. It is fucking cool. So that had an opening weekend of $158.4 million. And if you adjust for inflation, once again, that was 18 years ago, I'm sure that number would be considerably higher. But the budget for that film was $185 million, and it had a final worldwide box office total of $1,010 million. So this is his first billion-dollar grosser. It obviously had a huge influence on Hollywood, where people finally realized, whoa, you can make a superhero movie that's a crowd pleaser, a giant grosser, but also has like real artistic integrity with incredible performances, and just there's a lot going on with The Dark Knight to be admired. So I think it totally changed people's perception of what superhero movies could do, and sadly, we've kind of regressed since then in a lot of ways. Probably because Christopher Nolan is no longer interested in making superhero movies, but with his next movie, I think this is actually one of his most important achievements, because it was an original film, and it was a blockbuster film, and it had all the trappings of a big, giant franchise movie, but it was a standalone original movie, and I'm talking about Inception from 2010. And I know people love poking fun at it, because ever since South Park did an episode doing exactly that, then people have been ridiculing it and calling it Inception and all that stuff. But the reality is, this was an original screenplay with a budget of $160 million. It had an opening weekend of $62, but a final worldwide box office total of $826 million. And I think in a lot of ways, this might be the most impressive box office feat of Nolan's career, because Oppenheimer was based on a book. The Odyssey is obviously based on a book. Like, if you look at any of his big, giant grossers, they're always based on something, whether it's The Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Rises. Inception, he just cooked that thing up out of thin air. And name the last time you saw a big-budget filmmaker come along with an original idea that performed like that. It's incredibly rare, so I think people sometimes forget just how remarkable an achievement it was when he made Inception in 2010. But it wouldn't take long before Warner Brothers started poking him with the stick, saying, all right, that's all well and good, that's cute, you went off and made your original movie, but let's make another Batman movie. So they made The Dark Knight Rises in 2012, which to date is Christopher Nolan's most successful movie, at least in terms of worldwide box office. The budget on this movie was $230 million. Holy moly. But it opened to $160.8 million, which to date is the highest opening weekend of Christopher Nolan's career. And if you adjust for inflation, once again, that movie came out 14 years ago, that number would be even higher. But it had a final box office total of $1,082 million. So The Dark Knight Rises is not as good as The Dark Knight, but it's got individual scenes that are incredible. Like, basically from the time Batman and Catwoman go down into the sewers, beat up all of Bane's goons, and then they confront Bane, then Batman gets betrayed by Catwoman, and Bane beats the shit out of Batman and breaks his back. Yeah, that's a pretty astonishing sequence. I just wish the rest of the movie was as good as that, but sadly it's not. But I think after The Dark Knight, people were ready to, basically they were ready to eat whatever meal Christopher Nolan wanted to serve up. But after this, he said goodbye to Hollywood franchises, and he's basically been doing original films and or book adaptations ever since. So let's get into the second half of Christopher Nolan's career, where he officially establishes himself as the most successful auteur filmmaker alive today. And let's just dive right in with Interstellar in 2014, which had a production budget of $165 million, opened to $47 million, and had a final worldwide box office total of $642 million. I'm still not entirely convinced that Interstellar completely works from start to finish. I mean, the very end of the movie, I'm like, maybe I'm just too dumb to follow what's going on. But I like the first two-thirds quite a bit. But Nolan's love and affection for Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey is well documented. He put the movie back in theaters because he loves it so much. So this was his attempt at doing something like 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think he missed the mark to a degree, but at least he made the attempt. And what I most admire about the second half of Nolan's career is that with each film, he tackles completely new subject matter. He goes in a completely new direction with a completely new genre, which leads us to Dunkirk in 2017. I think one of his best films. That movie had a production budget of $150 million, opened to $50 million, but had kind of a soft final worldwide box office total of $528 million. Still a successful movie, still a profitable movie, but World War II historical epics are not quite as alluring in terms of a commercial appeal as like Batman, The Caped Crusader, etc. and so forth. But in the same way, I'm impressed that he took a 2,700-year-old story and turned it into box office gold. I'm equally impressed that he tackled a big, giant World War II epic in very satisfying fashion. But with his next movie, we get into kind of strange terrain because of the period in which it was released. So I'm talking about Tenet from 2020. And the big debate then was, when should it come out? If it will come out, so on and so forth. And at that time, Warner Brothers was doing a lot of experiments with HBO Max. And for basically a year or two, they got into this habit of putting movies in the theater as well as on HBO Max at the same time. And let's just say Christopher Nolan was having none of it, and he was so pissed off he parted ways with them once and for all. But I feel like Tenet was his attempt kind of doing a James Bond film with a little dash of science fiction, but it had a production budget of $205 million. It opened only to $20 million, but once again, this is during COVID. This is the fall. I think it opened in September of 2020, so a lot of people are still indoors with their masks, spraying their food, all that kind of stuff. But it had a final box office total of $366 million. If it had come out in 2019 or 2023, who knows how well it would have done. I don't think Tenet is his strongest movie by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, it's on the weaker end of his 13-film filmography. But I think it's safe to say it probably would have done double if it had opened under normal circumstances. Or who knows, maybe I'm just a blind Christopher Nolan fan. In any case, he bounced back big time with this next movie, which got sucked up in the maelstrom of the Barbenheimer phenomenon. And I'm talking about Oppenheimer from 2023, a movie which only had a production budget of $100 million. Once again, this is Nolan experimenting with a new studio at his new home of Universal. And I think he wrote the script and basically said, whichever studio is willing to pay the most for it, like, you got me, as long as your name is not Warner Brothers. And Universal scooped him up. But the movie opened to $82 million, which is about, two-thirds of what the Odyssey did. But it had a final box office tally of $976 million. And it is remarkable that he was able to turn a 3-hour movie, half of which is in black and white, but an R-rated drama about atomic energy or atomic weapons into a global blockbuster, which I think won 7 Oscars. So, yeah, a wildly successful movie, which opened the door to making the Odyssey. The question now is, can the Odyssey replace The Dark Knight Rises as his most successful movie? I'm going to predict that it doesn't, because I think when it comes to pop culture, The Caped Crusader is just more popular than Odysseus. But if I'm wrong, holy smokes, it might open the door to a whole new generation of filmmakers saying, hey, let's tackle like Egyptian mythology, or let's tackle Norse mythology, or let's tackle more Roman history, or tackle more Greek history. If somebody wanted to open the floodgates and start investing hundreds of millions of dollars into more sword and sandal epics, historical epics, religious epics, it would basically be like the 1950s all over again, where at that time, in order to compete with television was rapidly just eating the movie business alive. So the movies came up with very wide formats, kind of similar to our premium formats today, and they started tackling big subject matter like El Cid and the fall of the Roman Empire and the Ten Commandments and things like that, which eventually would reach its zenith with movies like Lawrence of Arabia. But if you love big screen epics made with casts of thousands, like on a big giant canvas, the 50s and the early 60s, it was that great heyday. But the reason that so many of those movies got made was because some of them were insanely successful. Like the Ten Commandments, it's one of the top 10 most popular movies ever made in terms of pure raw tickets sold. But let's stay focused on 2026 and look ahead to some of the films that might offer some healthy competition for the Odyssey in terms of being one of the biggest live-action movies of the year. And I think it's got three big rivals right over the horizon. We have Spider-Man, Brand New Day in 2 weeks. I think that movie very likely could be the most popular movie release this whole year. Maybe not the best, but certainly potentially the most popular. Then we have Doomsday and Dune Part 3 on the same goddamn weekend in December. I think the Odyssey will be better than Doomsday. My prediction is that it won't be better than Dune Part 3. I have a lot of reservations and concerns about Dune Part 3 because Denis Villeneuve is rewriting big chunks of Dune Messiah, in particular the character of Chani. Basically, you're giving yourself a lot of rope to hang yourself with anytime you fundamentally alter a very popular text. However, Christopher Nolan made a ton of alterations to the Odyssey, and people don't seem to care. So maybe Dune Part 3 won't gross quite as much as the Odyssey, but perhaps it'll be the best live-action movie of 2026. I would love for Dune Part 3 to be the best live-action movie of 2026, but we'll just have to wait and see. But with the Odyssey chewing up so much of everyone's bandwidth this past weekend, it didn't leave a lot of air in the conversation for any other movies to be discussed or enjoy any box office success. But as I like to do every week, I want to get the perspective of the official experts over at Variety. So Rebecca Rubin has an article titled Box Office, The Odyssey Stuns, with 124 million opening weekend, third biggest debut of the year. It's a box office debut fit for a king. Christopher Nolan's action epic, The Odyssey, ignited to 124.5 million from 3,919 domestic theaters over the weekend, defying expectations and setting up the R-rated spectacle for a long, long journey in theaters. These ticket sales are notable as Nolan's biggest debut since 2012's The Dark Knight Rises, 160 million, as well as the third largest opening of the year following Toy Story 5, 159 million, and the Super Mario Galaxy movie, 131 million. They're also impressive not just because The Odyssey is a nearly 3-hour sword and sandal adventure, a genre that's rarely made these days, but also because it is rated R, which limits who can buy tickets. At the international box office, The Odyssey collected $139.6 million from 73 markets for a stellar worldwide tally of $264.1 million. This marks Nolan's biggest global opening, ahead of The Dark Knight Rises, $249 million, not adjusted for inflation. 2009's The Dark Knight, $198 million, not adjusted for inflation. And Oppenheimer, $180 million. Adapted from Homer's 3,000-year-old epic poem, The Odyssey stars Matt Damon as Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, and chronicles his seemingly eternal, perilous voyage home after the Trojan War. Damon leads the all-star ensemble of Tom Holland, Anne Hathaway, Robert Pattinson, Lupita Nyong'o, Zendaya, Charlize Theron, Elliot Page, John Bernthal, and John Leguizamo. Written and directed by Nolan, The Odyssey is one of the best-reviewed films of the year, with an A grade on CinemaScore exit polls and 95% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes. Males accounted for 56% of ticket buyers, while half of audience members were between the ages of 18 and 34, underscoring that Nolan appeals to all generations of moviegoers. With stellar word of mouth, the frenzy around premium formats, and an A-list cast that's been taking the promotional circuit by storm, The Odyssey is primed for an epic box office run. Plus, it won't have any competition until Sony's Spider-Man Brand New Day opens on July 31st. That's necessary to justify the film's massive price tag. Universal spent $250 million to produce, a staggering cost for any tentpole these days, especially one that's rated R, and another $125 million to market to global audiences. Christopher Nolan is the only filmmaker working today who could take an ancient story like this, attract a cast as sprawling and accomplished as this, and make it a pop culture event, says David A. Gross, who publishes the box office newsletter Franchiserie. Nolan has become a unique and singular talent with a loyal and enthusiastic following. Nolan has long been a commercial draw, having directed outsized box office triumphs like the Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, Dunkirk, and Interstellar, but the British filmmaker reached a new level of fame after 2023's Oppenheimer, which became a box office juggernaut before securing the Oscar for Best Picture. Fueled by the Barbenheimer phenomenon, Oppenheimer launched above expectations to 82 million and earned a remarkable 330 million in North America and 975 million globally by the end of its run. While Oppenheimer opened in second place behind Barbie, another box office behemoth, The Odyssey gets the satisfaction of debuting at #1 across the globe. There's a palpable excitement in theaters this weekend, says Universal's domestic distribution president, Jim Orr. Christopher Nolan is one of the most trusted filmmakers ever, and audiences know he's going to deliver something that you want to experience on the big screen. We have showtimes in certain formats that are sold out for next weekend, the weekend after, and even midweek. Nolan has become synonymous with premium large formats, and The Odyssey is notable as the first feature shot entirely with IMAX cameras. It's a feat that Nolan has called his longest-held ambition. Audiences have taken note of the hype around these screens. Premium large formats contributed a massive 53% of the film's domestic tally, with IMAX accounting for 51.8 million, or 23% of global ticket sales. IMAX, which is dedicating its entire global footprint to The Odyssey for 3 weeks, has been scheduling showtimes around the clock in the coveted 70mm auditoriums, with some determined cinephiles enduring 2 a.m. and 7 a.m. screenings of the nearly 3-hour epic. The Odyssey is among a rarefied group of instant classic blockbusters in IMAX history that fully leverage our platform. As bullish as we are on its success, our experience tells us that even we don't know how this movie will grow our brand and business, says Rich Gelfond, CEO of IMAX. With record pre-sales, critical and audience acclaim, and the way the film presents extraordinarily in IMAX, we believe all the elements are in place for the Odyssey to enjoy a very long and successful run. Thanks to the Odyssey, the box office is rebounding after 3 consecutive duds: the Warner Brothers and DC adaptation Supergirl, Universal and Illumination sequel Minions and Monsters, and Disney's live-action Moana. Despite those stumbles, domestic ticket sales are roughly 10% above 2025, according to Rentrack, and the summer season is expected to surpass $4 billion for the second time since the pandemic upended the industry. Moana landed in a very distant second place with $19 million at its sophomore frame, a 56% decline from its disappointing $43 million debut. So far, Disney's live-action remake has generated $82 million domestically and $178 million globally. Since Moana was so expensive, it carries a $250 million price tag, and theater owners get to keep roughly half of revenues. The film is primed to lose at least $100 million in its theatrical run. Disney's summer has been mixed, with the studio fielding outsized hits like The Devil Wears Prada 2, $688 million, and Toy Story 5, along with big-budget misfires like Moana and Star Wars The Mandalorian and Grogu, $340 million against a $165 million budget. Minions and Monsters tied with Toy Story 5 for third place, with each film bringing in $14.8 million over the weekend. For Minions and Monsters, those ticket sales represent a 34% drop from the prior weekend and boost revenues to $137 million domestically and $323 million globally. Since prior entries in Universal and Illumination's Despicable Me franchise have reached or surpassed the $1 billion mark with ease, the newest Minions may wind up as the lowest grossing of the bunch. However, this installment was produced for $85 million and will turn a profit for the studio. Toy Story 5 is one of the summer's biggest hits, with $430 million in North America and $958 million worldwide after 5 weekends of release. It'll soon surpass $1 billion and eventually overtake its predecessor, 2019's Toy Story 4, $1.07 billion, as the highest grossing entry in the beloved franchise. Meanwhile, Supergirl dropped to number 9 with $1.5 million in its 4th weekend. After a month in theaters, the latest comic book adaptation from Warner Brothers and DC is fizzling, with $69.9 million domestically and $120 million globally. Given its hefty $170 million budget, Supergirl's projected to lose more than $120 million in its theatrical run. It's the second notable flop in 2026 for Warner Brothers, following this spring's The Bride, which flatlined with $23 million worldwide against a $90 million budget. Elsewhere, A24's comedy The Invite has collected $3.9 million from 2,110 screens, its widest footprint to date. After several weekends in limited release, Olivia Wilde's film has grossed a promising $15 million. So as we look ahead at the coming week, I think the Odyssey is going to continue to dominate. I mean, if you need evidence, go to Fandango and try to buy a ticket to see it in 70mm or IMAX 70mm at the AMC Lincoln Square here in New York. That is our best IMAX theater in the city. It's ridiculous, but that theater's incredibly popular. Anytime a big movie opens up, it's going to sell out round the clock for weeks. But what I always try to make people aware of, especially if they live in lower Manhattan, is the Village East by Angelica, because they do have a 70mm projector, but in terms of atmosphere and ambiance, it's my favorite theater in the city. It's a double-decker theater, and it used to be this old Yiddish theater like in the early 1900s. So it's all these like crazy carvings on the wall and that sort of thing. But it's an awesome theater. It also helps. It's like 5 blocks from where I live. So I love going over to the Village East by Angelica. So if you live in New York, check out the Odyssey over there. I'm sure they will appreciate the business. But as far as new releases are concerned, I have a ticket to see Motor City on the 21st, which is the new Alan Ritchson shoot 'em up. And I have a ticket to see Her Private Hell on Thursday, which is the latest movie by Nicholas Winding Refn, who I don't think he's made a movie since Neon Demon. He's made some shows, but holy smokes, that guy, after he made Drive, everybody thought he was going to be like the next big thing. And he's made some really cool flicks before and since, but in terms of box office, box office leprosy. He is, like, any movie he makes just seems doomed to obscurity. But I have a very strange relationship with him, where I admire his movies but kind of hate him as a person. And I shouldn't say hate him as a person. I get annoyed by him as a person. There's this great long interview where he interviews William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist and The French Connection and Sorcerer and all these incredible movies. And as you're watching this like 3-hour interview unfold, it's like, this guy Friedkin is so much cooler than this guy Refn, who just comes across I was like a bit of a dweeb, but who knows? Maybe her private hell will be fucking amazing. I'm like, all right, I take back everything I said about Nicholas Winding Refn. I look up to you and admire you all over again. But those are the reviews I'll be posting this week. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Will the Odyssey cross the coveted 1 billion mark, which so far Nolan has only done on 2 occasions with The Dark Knight Rises and The Dark Knight? We'll just have to wait and see, but we'll know in a few weeks' time. But that's all I've got for now. Thank you so much for watching the video. I greatly appreciate it. Remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, become a member, all that good stuff. Hope you have a great week, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.